The axe came down hard, then again and again. On a gray Wyoming morning, when the sky hung low and heavy like a held breath, a woman stood alone on a hillside and swung an axe into a frost-covered log with everything she had. Her boots were cracked at the sole. Her coat was too thin for the wind that cut across the ridge like a blade. Her hands, wrapped in strips of torn cloth because she had no proper gloves, were raw and red and trembling slightly between each swing. But she did not stop. She had not stopped in 3 days. Stopping, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing a person like her could do. Because when she stopped moving, the memories caught up, and the memories were worse than the cold. Her name was Lena Hart, and she was building herself a place to disappear. The cabin was half-framed, rough timber walls rising on one side, open sky above the rest. She had no blueprint, no contractor, no neighbor coming by with a casserole and kind words. She had a handsaw, a borrowed hammer, 47 nails she had counted twice, and the kind of stubbornness that only lives in a person after the world has taken everything else from them. She did not build out of joy, she built out of necessity. Because the town below, Harlow, Wyoming, population 600 and quietly cruel, had made it very clear, in the way small towns do without ever saying it directly, that Lena Hart was not welcome among them anymore. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. The left side of her face told a story she had not chosen to share. The scarring ran from her jaw to her temple, pale and tightened and permanent, the kind of mark that made strangers look away too quickly or stare too long. Children asked their mothers about it in whispered voices. Grown adults assumed, and assumptions, she had learned long ago, were far more dangerous than fire. Because fire had already done its worst. She had been 26 years old when she married Dale Hart. She had been hopeful then, quietly, carefully hopeful, the way a young woman is hopeful when she has grown up without much softness and finally believes she has found some. Dale had been charming in the beginning. He brought her wildflowers from the roadside in summer. He held doors. He told her she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and she had believed him because no one had ever said it before, and she did not yet know that some men use beauty not as a gift, but as a chain. The first year was good, or good enough, or at least quiet enough that she could convince herself it was good, which is a thing people do when they are trying very hard to believe in something. The second year, things began to shift, small things at first, a sharpness in his voice when dinner was late, a coldness that would settle over him for days without explanation, a way he had of looking at her sometimes that made her feel she had done something wrong without knowing what. She told herself it was stress. Men carried stress differently. She would be more patient. She would be more careful. The third year, she learned what careful really meant. It meant measuring every word before she spoke it. It meant reading the sound of his boots on the porch steps, heavy or light, slow or fast, and adjusting herself accordingly before he ever opened the door. It meant wearing long sleeves in July. It meant telling the woman at the pharmacy, who asked once with gentle eyes, that she had walked into a cabinet door in the dark. It meant becoming very, very small inside a life that had slowly closed around her like a fist. The town saw what they chose to see. Dale was well liked. He shook hands firmly and paid his tab at the diner and showed up to church on the third Sunday of every month. And Lena, quiet, careful Lena with her long sleeves and her measured words, was simply a private woman. Some women were just private. The fourth year was the last one. It was a February evening. The wind was screaming down from the mountains, and the house was cold because Dale had forgotten to order the heating oil, and when Lena mentioned it, carefully, quietly, in the gentlest possible way, because she had spent 3 years learning exactly how to say difficult things in the least dangerous way possible, she watched something change in his face. A darkening, a shift, the particular look she had come to fear more than any other thing in her life, because she knew what always followed it. What happened in the next hour she carried inside her like shards of broken glass, too sharp to examine directly, too deeply embedded to ever fully remove. She remembered the sound of her own voice, very small, saying please. She remembered the floor against her cheek and the strange, cold smoothness of it. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that frightened her in its calmness, that she was very tired. Not sleepy, not simply exhausted. Tired in a way that went all the way down to something that felt like the floor of her soul. She did not know, lying there on that kitchen floor on that February night, how the fire started. She would spend years not knowing, turning it over in her mind during long, silent nights and never arriving at certainty. Whether it was his rage or his carelessness or something the cold and the wind and the old wiring in that old house had conspired to produce, she could not say. What she knew was that she woke to heat, an orange light, and the smell of something irreplaceable burning, and she moved, not with thought, not with decision, but with the blind animal need to survive that lives beneath thought and decision in the oldest part of a person. She crawled across the kitchen floor. She pushed through the back door. She fell into the snow, and the cold hit her face with a violence that was also, in its way, a mercy, because in that moment she felt it. Later, she would not feel that side of her face the same way again, but in that moment she felt everything. She lay in the snow and looked at the sky, and the orange light moved across the clouds above her, and somewhere behind her, the house made sounds she would hear for the rest of her life. Dale did not make it out. The town grieved him. They brought food to the funeral and spoke about what a tragedy it was, and what a good man he had been, and what a shame. Nobody brought anything to Lena's hospital room except a deputy with a notepad and careful eyes. The investigation found nothing definitive. The fire had been hot and thorough and conclusive in the way fires are, leaving behind more questions than answers. But a town does not need answers. A town needs a story. And the story that Harlow chose, the one that let them grieve Dale comfortably without examining the long sleeves or the careful words, or the way Lena had always seemed to be bracing for something, was that she had started it. Nobody said it officially. Nobody needed to. It moved through the town the way these things move, person to person, glance to glance, until it had the weight and permanence of fact without ever having been proven. She left Harlow with a bag of clothing, $40, and the particular lightness of a person who has had everything taken and discovered that the taking means nothing can threaten her anymore. She found the hillside by accident, a piece of land nobody wanted, too exposed and too cold, accessible only by a road that was mud in spring and ice in winter. She bought it for almost nothing, and she began to build. Not because she believed in the future, not yet, but because her hands needed something to do besides shake. Ethan Cole saw her for the first time on a Tuesday, and it changed him in ways he would not be able to articulate for months. He had ridden up the ridge to check a section of fence line that kept pulling loose on the north corner of his property, a small, ordinary errand on a small, ordinary morning. The coal ranch sat on 400 acres of cold Wyoming land that his grandfather had broken with his hands, and his father had held together with stubbornness, and Ethan had inherited at 32, along with two things he had never asked for: a reputation as the steadiest, most dependable man in the county, and a grief so quiet and complicated that most people had long since stopped asking about it. He had been married once. Her name was Claire, and she had been beautiful and restless and deeply, chronically unhappy in the way some people are, not because of any single wound, but because of a temperamental mismatch with the life they find themselves in. The land was too empty. The winters were too long. Ethan was too even, too predictable, too much the same solid weight every single morning when she woke up wanting something she could not name. He had felt her unhappiness for years, had felt it the way you feel weather changing, in the pressure of the air, in the quality of silences, and had said nothing, because he had believed, in the particular way quiet men believe, that if he was steady enough, and patient enough, and present enough, it would eventually resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. One November evening she had driven into town through a building snowstorm and had not come back. They said the road was icy. They said it was an accident. Ethan had stood at her grave in the December cold and waited to feel the grief that everyone around him seemed to expect. And what he felt instead, beneath the shock and the loss and the genuine sorrow for a life ended too soon, was something he could not say to a living soul. Relief. Not because he had not cared for her, but because he had known, in the place where a person knows things before they can admit them, that they had been making each other quietly miserable for a very long time. And the relief of that ending, arriving alongside the genuine grief of her loss, had produced in him a shame so heavy and so private that he had carried it alone for 3 years without setting it down once. He was not a cruel man. He was not a cold man. He was a man who had spent so long being what everyone needed him to be that he had lost track of what he actually was. And then he rode up to a fence line on a cold Tuesday morning and saw a woman in a cracked coat swinging an axe alone on a hillside with the kind of fierce, exhausted, self-pitying free determination that he had not seen in a very long time, maybe ever. Something in him went very still, not the stillness of indifference, the stillness of recognition. He watched for longer than was polite, and then he turned his horse and rode back down without saying a word. But he came back the next morning, and the one after that. On the 4th morning she saw him. She set the axe down slowly and turned to face him, and she did not look frightened. She looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, the deep, settled tiredness of a person who has been holding themselves braced for a very long time. "You going to keep watching?" she said, "or are you going to say what you came to say?" Ethan dismounted. He held his hat in both hands, not from nerves, she would understand later, but because it was simply what he did when he was trying to be honest. "I've got timber," he said, "seasoned oak, already cut, sitting in my barn doing nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not asking for charity." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering any. I need someone to cook and mend. My housekeeper left in September, and I haven't eaten a proper meal since." He paused. "It's a trade, nothing more." Lena looked at the half-built walls around her. She looked at the sky, gray and thickening, promising snow within the week. She looked at her hands. "No emotions," she said. "No expectations." "Agreed," he said. "And you don't ask about my face." He met her eyes and held them steadily. "I wasn't planning to." She nodded once. "Then bring the timber." He brought the timber, and then he brought his tools. And then, without either of them naming it or planning it, he began showing up every morning just after sunrise, and they would work side by side through the short winter days, and she would cook something plain and hot on the small camp stove, and they would eat together without many words, and he would ride home in the cold dark. It was not romantic. It was not easy. There were mornings when Lena's hands shook too badly to hold a nail straight, and she would turn away until they steadied, because she would not be watched in her weakness. There were evenings when Ethan sat too long with his eyes on the middle distance, and she did not ask why, because she recognized that particular kind of silence. It was not an invitation, it was a shelter. But something was happening between them, slowly, in the way it only happens between two people who have both, separately and for different reasons, stopped performing. It started with the smallest things, the way he passed her tools before she had to ask, the way she left coffee warming on the stove before he arrived each morning. The afternoon he laughed, quietly, genuinely, with real surprise, when she told him without any expression whatsoever that his sawing technique was inefficient, and the way she looked briefly startled by her own dry humor, as though she had almost forgotten it existed inside her. There was a Tuesday when they were fitting a window frame together, and their hands occupied the same piece of wood for several minutes in complete cooperative silence, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them mentioned it afterward, but something had shifted. There was a Wednesday evening when the temperature dropped so sharply that their breath made clouds in the half-built cabin, and Ethan built the fire up higher without being asked, and Lena sat close to it, and for a while neither of them spoke, and it was the most comfortable either of them had been in longer than they could calculate. There was a Thursday afternoon when she caught him looking at the scarred side of her face, not with the flinching pity she was used to, not with the prurient curiosity she had also learned to expect, but with something quiet and undemanding, the way a person looks at a landscape that has clearly been through something difficult and is still standing, and is still, in its way, beautiful. She held his gaze for a moment. He did not look away in embarrassment. He simply returned to what he was doing, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind. One evening, when the wind was howling outside and the fire was the only warm thing for miles, she told him about Dale. She had not planned to. It came the way true confessions come between people who have spent enough quiet time together, not through decision, but through accumulation, through enough shared silences that the words, when they finally came, had somewhere safe to land. She told him about the wildflowers at the beginning, about learning to read footsteps on a porch, about 4 years of long sleeves and measured words, and the particular discipline of becoming very small inside a life that kept shrinking. She told him about the floor against her cheek and the strange, calm clarity she had felt. Not dramatic, not like anything she had ever seen in a movie, just an immense and terrible tiredness. She told him about crawling out the back door into the snow, about the cold and the orange light, and the sounds the house made as it burned. She told him about the hospital, about the deputy with the notepad, about the town and their casseroles for Dale's funeral, and their carefully averted eyes for hers. About the story that moved through Harlow like smoke, quiet, shapeless, impossible to argue against, settling into everything. She told it without tears, without drama, the way a person tells a story they have survived so completely that the telling no longer destroys them, even though the marks it left are still written on their skin. Ethan listened the way almost no one in her life had ever listened, not to respond, not to comfort, not to perform compassion. He listened the way you listen when you understand that the person speaking has been waiting a very long time for someone to simply receive what they are saying, without turning it into something about themselves. When she finished, the fire spoke for a while instead. Then Ethan said, quietly, without looking away from the flames, I felt relief when Claire died. Not grief, relief. And I have carried that alone for 3 years. The weight of those words moved through the small cabin like something physical. Because you knew she was unhappy, Lena said, not a question. Because I knew we both were, he said, and I had never let myself say it while she was alive, and then she was gone, and it was too late to say it, and all I had left was the relief and the shame of it. They sat with that for a long time. 2 people on a Wyoming hillside holding their most private and heaviest shames out in the open air between them, not asking for forgiveness, not offering it, not trying to make it smaller or more palatable, just letting it exist, just being, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. That night changed something, not with declarations, not with anything dramatic. The air between them simply became softer. A door that had always been locked opened the smallest fraction and was left that way. The storm came in late November without warning. By morning, the world outside was white and absolute. The temperature fell to numbers that had no business existing where people lived. For 4 days, neither of them could go anywhere. They were not frightened. They were, in a way that neither of them said aloud, relieved. They played cards at the small table, and Ethan won twice, and Lena accused him of counting, and he said he didn't need to, and she said that was exactly what someone who was counting would say, and he laughed, that real laugh, the unguarded one she was learning to recognize, and the sound of it in the small, warm cabin was one of the finest things she had heard in years. They debated the correct way to reinforce a roof beam with the seriousness of people who genuinely disagreed and both knew they were right. She cooked dried beans with salt pork over the camp stove, and it was the best thing he had eaten all winter, and he told her so plainly, and she said it was just beans, and he said some people couldn't make just beans taste like that, and she was quiet for a moment, and then said, "My mother taught me," before she passed. He did not push, he simply nodded, and the small piece of her life that she had offered lay between them gently, received without being examined. On the 3rd night, when the wind had eased and the lantern burned low and warm between them, Ethan read aloud from an old paperback he had found in his saddlebag, a Western, worn at the spine. His voice was low and even in the darkness. Lena sat across from him with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes closed. She was not listening to the story, she was listening to the fact of it, that someone was filling the silence around her without asking anything in return, that she was not alone in a room and afraid of it, that quiet could be something other than the held breath before something bad happened. It was not a small thing. It was, for Lena Hart, one of the largest things she had known in years. On the 3rd night, she said, without planning to, "I'm not pretty. I know what I look like. I see it every time I pass anything reflective." He set the book down. He looked at her, not at the scars, not at the side she always angled slightly away, but at her, all of her. The steadiness and the wariness and the dry humor and the extraordinary, quiet, unbreakable something at the core of her that had crawled out of a burning house and bought a piece of land nobody wanted and started building with 47 nails and bare hands. "That's fine," he said, quietly, simply. "I need honest, not fancy." She did not cry. Lena Hart had not cried in so long she was not certain the mechanism still worked, but something happened behind her eyes, a shift, a releasing, like a knot her whole body had been tied around for years, just barely, just at the edges, beginning to loosen. And she turned her face back toward the lantern light and did not hide the scarred side and did not angle away. She just sat there, in the warm and the quiet, and let herself be seen. It was the bravest thing she had done since crawling out a back door. Spring was beginning to suggest itself when they finally came down from the ridge together into Harlow to resupply. The town noticed. It noticed before they had finished tying the horses. Eyes moved across the street. Women leaned toward each other behind gloved hands. The word arrangement passed between people with an inflection that made it mean something considerably uglier than the word itself. Lena felt it the way she had always felt this town, not in any single moment, but as a climate, a pressure, a sustained and practiced exclusion. Ethan felt it too. He felt the weight of 600 people who had known him his whole life, now measuring him against their expectations and finding the arithmetic unsatisfactory. He felt his reputation, that careful, steady, dependable reputation he had maintained his whole adult life, pressing on him like a hand on his shoulder, steering him. A man he had known since boyhood caught him outside the feed store and clapped that hand on his shoulder and said, loudly, comfortably, with the confidence of someone who has never had to question whether their comfort cost someone else something, "Been here and you spend a lot of time up on the ridge these days, Ethan. Hope it's worth the talk." And Ethan, good, steady, dependable Ethan, heard himself say 3 words. "It's just work." Lena was standing 6 feet away. She heard every syllable. She did not flinch. She did not look at him. She gave the town nothing, not her pain, not her reaction, not a single thing they could carry home and examine. She finished loading the supply bag, mounted her horse with the straight-backed efficiency of a woman who had survived far worse than this, and rode back up the ridge alone. She did not look back. The cabin was finished. That was the particular cruelty of it. All the work was done. The walls were solid. The roof was tight. The window faced east the way she had always wanted, and in the mornings the light came through it, golden and clean, and landed on the floor she had laid herself, plank by plank, nail by nail. She had everything she had come to that hillside to build. And she had never in her life felt more alone inside a completed thing. She did not let herself be angry for long. Anger required a certain kind of hope, a belief that things ought to have been different, and Lena had learned the hard discipline of not hoping extravagantly. What she felt was quieter and more final, the specific, bone-deep grief of a person who had almost trusted something and who had been reminded by the most familiar kind of lesson, delivered by the most unexpected person, exactly why she had stopped. She told herself it was better to know now. She told herself she was fine. She sat in her east-facing window in the dark and watched the stars and was not fine at all. Ethan spent 3 days in a misery he knew he had fully earned. He replayed those 3 words endlessly, not with anger at himself, but with something worse, understanding. He understood exactly why he had said them. He understood the mechanism of it, the long habit of managing other people's comfort, the reflex of a man who had spent his whole life being what a room needed him to be. He understood it completely, and that understanding made it worse, not better, because it meant his failure had not been a moment of weakness, it had been a revelation of character. He thought about riding up to the ridge. He thought about what he would say, something worthy, something true. And each time he reached the part of the imagining where she looked at him, he knew. Words were not what he owed her. On the 4th day, he rode into Harlow at noon. The general store was full, the way it was always full at midday, the town's daily business bringing people together in the close, warm space. He walked through the door, and he stood in the middle of that room, and he spoke clearly enough for every person present to hear. He said that Lena Hart was not an arrangement. He said that she was the most honest person he had known in his adult life, and that honesty like hers was rarer than anything this town had to offer. He said the town had failed her once, had chosen a comfortable story over an uncomfortable truth, had looked away when looking away was easier than seeing, and that he had just done the same thing, and he was finished with both. He said her past was not the town's property, and her face was not the town's conversation, and if anyone felt differently, they were welcome to come find him on the north corner of his property, where he would be working, and where he no longer cared in the slightest what they thought. Nobody spoke. He bought his supplies and walked out into the cold, and rode up to the ridge. He did not bring words. He brought his tools. He tied his horse at the post, walked to the one remaining section of the porch railing that had never been finished, picked up his hammer, and began to work. The sound of it rang out clear and steady in the cold air. Lena appeared in the cabin doorway. She stood there for a long time, long enough that the cold moved through her coat, long enough to watch his hands, to read his posture, to understand what he was doing and what he was not doing, and what that meant. Her face did not change. She did not make it easy. She stood in that doorway in the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to take her time with trust, because she knows what rushing it costs. Then, without a word, she walked to the other end of the unfinished railing, picked up her own hammer, and began to work beside him. No forgiveness spoken, no acknowledgement exchanged, just two people, side by side, finishing what they had started. That was all. That was everything. Winter and let go slowly. Wyoming winters always do. They release their grip inch by reluctant inch, a little more light each morning, a little less bite in the wind each afternoon, until one day the air smells of cold mud and possibility, and the first small green things push up through the last of the frost, like quiet, stubborn acts of faith. The cabin stood, solid and real and earned in every board and beam and nail. They stood too, not healed completely. A person does not heal completely from the things they had each survived, not without the weight of their separate histories, but present, choosing, returning each morning to the same ground and the same work and the same person, because that is what real things require of you. Not perfection, not the absence of history, just the daily choice to show up. One April evening, the sun went down behind the ridge in colors that seemed almost too generous for a world that had been so hard on both of them, deep orange and rose, and the particular clear gold that only comes in the last minutes of a long winter's ending. Ethan set down what he was holding. He turned to look at her. Not at a version of her, not at the woman he needed her to be or the story he had told himself about who she was. At her, Lena, the woman who had counted 47 nails, who had corrected his sawing technique without blinking, who had told the truth about the worst night of her life in a plain, steady voice and not asked him to carry it for her, only to hear it. Who had picked up her hammer when words would have been easier and insufficient, who was standing now in the last of the April light with her face turned toward the valley and the scar on her jaw catching the gold of the evening in a way that was, he thought, one of the most honest and beautiful things he had ever seen. "I'd like to keep doing this," he said, "for the rest of whatever time I have, if you're willing." The valley was quiet below them. New grass moved in the evening wind. Somewhere a horse called out and was answered from across the ridge. Lena was still for a long moment, a long, full, unhurried moment, the kind she took her time with because she had learned that her time was hers and nobody had the right to rush it. Then she smiled. It started at the corner of her mouth, slow and uncertain and real, the way smiles come when they have been away a long time. It moved across her face, both sides of it, the smooth and the scarred together, without apology, without the careful angling away she had practiced for so long. It was unguarded and unhurried, and it was the most beautiful thing Ethan Cole had ever seen in his life, and he knew he would carry it with him until his last day. "Ask me again in the morning," he said. "I want to sleep on it." He laughed, that quiet, genuine, completely unperformed laugh that she had come to love without ever making the decision to. "I'll ask you every morning," he said, "until you're ready." He kept his word. Every morning, without pressure and without performance, the way a man asks when he already understands that the answer belongs entirely to her, that it always has, that it always should. Some mornings she said, "Ask me tomorrow." Some mornings she just looked at him with those careful eyes and almost smiled and said nothing. He waited. He showed up. He asked again. And one morning, her terms, her unhurried time, she looked at him across the rim of her coffee cup in the light of the east-facing window, with the spring coming in warm and golden through the glass, and she said, "Yes." Not because she needed him to survive. She had proven she could survive without anyone. Not because the winter had been long and he had been warm, though both of those things were true. She said yes because he had stood in a room full of people and told the truth when silence would have been so much easier. Because he had come back with a hammer instead of a speech. Because in all the months she had known him, he had never once asked her to be smaller, quieter, less scarred, less complicated, less herself. And that, she had decided in the long, careful privacy of her own heart, was worth saying yes to. Pretty things fade. Easy things fail, but what two people build together through honesty and cold mornings and shared labor and failure and the specific courage it takes to stand still and be truly seen by another person, that does not fade. That holds through every winter. That lasts. This is not a story about perfect people finding each other. It never was. It is a story about two imperfect, marked, exhausted, honest people who made a simple agreement on a cold hillside and kept showing up and built, slowly and stubbornly and with their own hands, something real, something that required nothing of them except the truth. And the truth, in the end, was more than enough. If this story reached something inside you, if you recognized yourself in Lena's silence, or in Ethan's regret, or in that long, quiet winter between two people who were both so tired of pretending, then you are exactly who Desert Hearth was made for. Subscribe to this channel and stay with us, because every week we bring you stories like this one, about quiet courage and earned love, and the kind of people the world overlooks but never, never forgets. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and please share this story with someone who needs to hear today that broken does not mean finished, that scarred does not mean unworthy, and that the most beautiful things in a life are not the ones that come easily, they are the ones you build. This story carries deep and lasting value. It portrays domestic violence not as spectacle, but as the quiet, daily, invisible endurance that it truly is. The long sleeves, the measured words, the reading of footsteps, and in doing so honors every person who has lived that reality and never seen it named so plainly. It shows that survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply crawling out a back door and deciding the next morning to keep going. It gives voice to the shame that survivors carry when a community chooses comfort over truth, validating an experience that millions of viewers have lived but rarely seen reflected back with this kind of dignity. It shows that real accountability is public, that genuine redemption requires action rather than words, and that trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt through patience and consistency, not through eloquence.
And for older American viewers who have lived through complicated love, profound loss, community judgment, and the long, hard work of beginning again, this story does not offer easy comfort or false resolution. It offers something rarer and more lasting: recognition. The profound, healing feeling that their lives, difficult, imperfect, marked, surviving, have been seen and honored and told.